Before our history began, there was another world, and the night it ended, humanity had to begin again. Not because we wanted to, not because we were ready, but because whatever existed before us, whatever was stable, whatever was ordered, whatever was ruled, was suddenly gone. There is a chapter of human history that does not belong to us. A chapter so old that we can't place it comfortably inside our timelines. A chapter so fractured that it survives only as fragments. And a chapter so violently erased that the people who remained did something very specific. They carved memory into clay, not for beauty, not for glory, not to impress anyone, but because they feared something worse than death. They feared a second forgetting. And that is where this story begins. Not in a temple, not in a palace, not in a myth told for entertainment. It begins in a document, a ledger, a list, a record so plain in its format, so bureaucratic in its structure, that it almost hides what it contains. Almost. Because inside it there is a dynasty that vanishes overnight. A dynasty whose rulers do not reign for decades, but for spans so long that the human mind rejects them on instinct. Thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, and then, without warning, without transition, without explanation, one line appears. A line that does not soften the blow. A line that does not interpret itself. A line that simply states what happened. Then the flood swept over, and everything changes. So, before we descend any deeper into this erased chapter, let's sit with a question that will not leave easily. If the kings before the flood were wiped out in a single night, how much of their world should still remain today? A few myths, a few ruins, a few strangely preserved numbers on clay, or nothing at all. Because if their world truly ended, if it truly collapsed all at once, then the absence of evidence becomes part of the evidence. The silence becomes part of the testimony. The emptiness becomes its own kind of record. And still, something remains. A trace. Not in a monument, not in a golden artifact, not even in a city that can be excavated cleanly. A trace remains in a list. Tonight, we follow that trace. And I want you to notice something as we move forward. We are not chasing isolated mysteries. We are following connections. Because every myth in this story points to a ruin. Every ruin points to a layer. Every layer points to a break in continuity. And every break in continuity returns us to the same question, again and again from different angles, like circling a wound we don't want to touch. Who were the kings before the flood? And why did their disappearance become one of the most carefully preserved traumas in human memory? The document that carries this trauma has a name. You may have heard it. You may think you already know what it is. The Sumerian King List. But the version most people know, the version treated like a historical curiosity, is only the surface. And surfaces are deceptive. Because the deeper layer of this text does something that history is not supposed to do. It records rulers who reigned for 18 to 600 years, 28, 800 years, 36,000 years. Numbers so large they stop feeling like numbers and start feeling like a statement. A statement about scale, a statement about time, a statement about a world that does not operate like ours. And then again, without mercy, without explanation, comes that same line, that then the flood swept over. And here is where the modern mind rebels, because we instinctively want to categorize this. We want to say, That's mythology. We want to say that's exaggeration. We want to say that's symbolic. And you can say those things, but you have to explain something first. You have to explain why a text that behaves like administration, like record keeping, suddenly contains time spans that are impossible and then pivots into time spans that are recognizably human. You have to explain why the impossible lives only on one side of the flood. And you have to explain why scribes copied those impossible numbers anyway, because this is not a single tablet that someone wrote once. This is a text that was copied and copied and recopied across kingdoms, across centuries, for over 1,000 years. They didn't erase the impossibility. They preserved it. Which raises the question in its rawest form. Why would a bureaucracy preserve something that makes it look absurd? There is another question embedded in this, and it is even more unsettling. Why does the moment their world ends, the moment the text says, "Then the flood swept over," a line in the script you've brought here? With a geological cataclysm, modern science dates to 12,800 years ago. We will return to that. We will return to it more than once, because it is the hinge on which everything in this story turns. But we cannot leap to the hinge and pretend the door will hold. We have to reconstruct the structure piece by piece. We have to move slowly, because this story is not built for speed. It is built for weight. So let's begin where the text begins. Not with fire, not with water, with a sentence. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Notice what it does not say. It does not say kingship was invented. It does not say kingship evolved. It does not say humans figured it out. It says kingship descended, as if it existed already somewhere else before it arrived here, as if authority itself had an origin outside the human story. And then the list continues in a voice that is almost numb with procedure. Name, city, reign length, next, no embellishment, no mythic poetry, no dramatic scenes, just data. And the data is impossible. The first King Alulim, 28,800 years. The next Alalgar, 36,000 years. Then more names, more reigns. The numbers fall in patterns. They sit in multiples. They look calculated. And the list does not pause to apologize for them. It doesn't explain. It simply records. Then it marches through ancient cities Eridu, and then others tracking transfers of kingship, as if tracking the movement of an office from one administrative center to another. And then suddenly the sentence arrives that splits history in half. Then the flood swept over, and the list restarts, not by invention, by restoration. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. Again, lowered from heaven. Again, the repetition matters, because repetition is how survivor documents speak. They don't just tell you what happened, they circle it, they return to it, they restate it not to clarify, but to make sure it cannot be lost. And after this line, something shifts. The reign lengths shrink. They are still large at first, still strange, but they begin to move toward the human scale. And as the list continues forward through time, it becomes increasingly recognizable. Names begin to touch the edge of history. Reigns become decades instead of millennia. The document normalizes, which means the anomaly is not random. It has a boundary, it has a dividing line, it has a before and an after, and the dividing line is the flood. So we are faced with two worlds recorded in one ledger. One world where kingship endures across spans the mind cannot hold. Another world where kingship is fragile, mortal shrinking fractured. One world that ends with a sentence. Another world that begins again with the same sentence repeated. And the scribes who copied this did not treat it like a story. They treated it like an archive. Which leads us to a possibility that is uncomfortable, precisely because it fits the way the document behaves. What if the King List is not a collection of legends? What if it is a traumatized record of a final dynasty before a catastrophic reset? Not a clean history, not a modern chronology, but a survivor document. A list that preserves the outline of what existed, because the details were burned away. If that is true, then these kings were not characters. They were the last holders of an order that was real enough to be mourned, real enough to be copied, real enough to haunt scribes for 15 centuries. And then we have to confront the question that follows naturally from that possibility. If the world of the kings before the flood ended suddenly, what ended it? What kind of event erases an entire ruling class? What kind of event is remembered, not as a slow collapse, but as a single, overwhelming sweep? And why do so many cultures in so many places remember something that sounds like the same break? We are not there yet, not fully, but you can feel the shape of it approaching. Because the King List doesn't exist in isolation. It lives inside a larger human pattern, a pattern of flood memory, of fire memory, of darkness, memory of before and after memory. And when you begin to see that pattern, the question stops being, is this mythology? The question becomes, why does mythology behave like a record of trauma? Why does it repeat the same sequence? Why does it preserve the same pivot point? Why does it keep returning to the same boundary? And why do the scribes keep copying again and again and again? Not because it was entertaining, because it was important, because someone somewhere believed the truth inside those impossible numbers mattered enough to survive time. So we begin here, with the ledger that remembers what we have forgotten, with the sentence that splits human history into two incompatible halves, with the question that archaeology still cannot answer cleanly. Why does impossibility appear only before the flood? And why does it stop only after? And if it stopped, what stopped it? If we examine this text the way the scribes seem to examine it, not as poetry, not as allegory, but as a document type, something becomes difficult to ignore. It does not read like mythology. It reads like bureaucracy, and bureaucracy has a very specific personality. It is repetitive, it is structured, it is cold. It does not usually invent impossibilities without reason, because its job is continuity. Its job is record keeping. Its job is to make power legible, which is exactly what the King List does. It tracks cities. It tracks throne transfers. It tracks the movement of kingship, as if kingship were an office that could be carried from one administrative center to another. And it survives in multiple copies, fragments, tablets, prisms spread across Mesopotamia. The oldest versions in your script cluster around the early 2nd millennium BCE. But the scribes themselves were not inventing it then. They were copying from older sources that were already old to them, and they copied with a kind of insistence that matters. Because we need to stay honest about what we're seeing, they did not copy this once as a curiosity. They copied it continuously for over 1,000 years. Why? And don't answer too quickly, because the obvious answers fail under the weight of the document's behavior. If you say the numbers were symbolic, you have to explain why the symbolism ends at the flood. If you say the numbers were exaggeration, you have to explain why the exaggeration is mathematically patterned. If you say the numbers are merely myth, you have to explain why the myth is formatted like an archive. And if you say the scribes invented it to glorify their civilization, you have to explain why they preserved something that makes their civilization look derivative. Because the King List does something subtle but devastating. It implies that kingship did not begin with the scribes who wrote it. It implies kingship existed before them. And not just kingship as an idea, kingship as a system that was already ancient, even when they encountered it. Again, after kingship descended from heaven. Not after kingship was established. Not after kingship emerged. Descended. That word carries a direction. From above to below. From elsewhere to here. Now, let's return to the first entries slowly, because the strangeness is not only in the numbers, but in their tone. The list does not say, there were legends of kings who ruled for millennia. It does not say, it is said. It does not say, in ancient times myth tells us. It simply states, Alulim reigned 28,800 years. Alalgar reigned 36,000 years. Name, number. The voice is the voice of accounting. And then again, without explanation. Then the flood swept over. If this were myth, we would expect drama. We would expect narrative. But the list refuses drama. It gives you the rupture as a single administrative line, like a clerk marking a disaster in the margin of an inventory. And that is what makes it feel like trauma, because trauma often appears in that form, not as an eloquent speech, not as a carefully interpreted lesson, as a blunt marker, a boundary, a line you do not cross without feeling the absence. Now look at what happens after that line. Kingship is lowered from heaven again. Again. And it goes to Kish. And the reign lengths, still strange, still expanded, collapse toward the human. They shrink. They shrink as the list moves forward in time. And the shrinking is not chaotic. It is directional. It is as if the post-flood world is trying to imitate something it can no longer sustain. As if the system survived, but the mechanism didn't. And this becomes the emotional core of the document, because it is not merely saying there were ancient kings. It is saying there was a world. Then there was a break. Then there was a restart. And the restart was not equal to what came before. It was reduced. It was fragmented. It was mortal. And the list preserves that reduction with the same voice it uses for everything else, which suggests the reduction is not a storyteller's flourish. It is the document's actual memory. Now, a modern scholar reading this wants to resolve the embarrassment. They want to normalize the text. They want to rescue it from its own impossibility, so they offer theories, symbolism, astronomical cycles, alternative year counting, dynastic totals misread as individual reigns, and those theories may or may not help. But notice what none of them fully explain. Why does the impossibility cluster only before the flood? Why does it stop abruptly at the flood? Why does the normalization happen after? Why do the scribes preserve the boundary so carefully? And why, if this is only metaphor, do they treat it like an archive? Because archives are not usually built to carry metaphor. They are built to carry legitimacy. They are built to carry continuity. They are built to carry the idea that power did not begin today. It began earlier. And it will continue tomorrow, unless something breaks it. Unless something breaks it. That unless is the shadow inside the King List. Because the document doesn't merely preserve kings, it preserves a warning. It says this has happened once. A world ended, a system collapsed, and what survived was not the world itself, but the record that it existed. And if you're a scribe living thousands of years later, writing in the shadow of cities, temples, laws, you do not treat that record lightly. You copy it. You preserve it, even if it makes you look foolish to anyone who reads it later, because you are not copying it for them. You are copying it for the future, for the next collapse, for the next time continuity breaks. That is why this list is not just a curiosity. It behaves like something that wants to outlive you. And that brings us back again to the question we can't avoid. If this is a survivor record, a ledger of two worlds, then what ended the first one? What kind of event is powerful enough to erase the rulers of the old world overnight? What kind of event is remembered everywhere as flood, but also as fire and darkness and disappearance? Because here is where the story expands beyond Mesopotamia. The King List is one piece of a much larger human obsession. Across continents, across languages, across oceans, flood memory repeats. And not as a vague "there was water," as a sequence, a structured trauma, a before, an after, and a boundary in between. And when you look closely at that boundary in myth after myth, a detail keeps returning quietly, insistently. Many stories do not begin with water. They begin with something from above, something like fire, something like the sky breaking, and then the flood, and then the world resets, and then the old ones are gone. And someone tries to rescue knowledge, rescue the seeds, rescue the crafts, rescue the skills, rescue the memory, not because survival is enough, because survival without memory is a second death. So when we move from the King List into the global flood pattern, we are not leaving evidence behind. We are following it outward. Because every road in this story, mythological, archaeological, geological, keeps turning back toward the same haunting sentence. Then the flood swept over. And the question becomes, what did that sentence originally mean? And what did it cost to write it down? When most people think of flood myths, they imagine something small and local. A river overflowing its banks. A seasonal disaster exaggerated over generations. A village wiped out by rain and remembered as the end of the world. That assumption feels reasonable until you actually line the stories up next to each other and notice how specific they are. Not poetic, not vague, specific, repetitive, structured, and disturbingly consistent. Across cultures that never met, never traded, never shared language, the same sequence appears again and again. Something comes from the sky. Something burns. The world goes dark. The waters rise. The old rulers disappear. Knowledge is rescued. And a diminished world begins again. This is not how metaphor behaves. Metaphor adapts. It mutates. It absorbs local color. But trauma behaves differently. Trauma repeats. Trauma circles. Trauma preserves sequence even when details blur. And when you read flood narratives as memory rather than invention, a pattern emerges that is hard to ignore. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Atrahasis describes the Anunnaki unleashing destruction not only through water but through fire and storm. The text explicitly says the gods lit up the land with lightning fire before the flood. The storm does not last weeks. It lasts a single day, one day of annihilation. The language is compressed, almost clinical, as if describing something too overwhelming to elaborate on. Then comes darkness, then water, then silence. Move north to Anatolia, where damaged Hittite fragments preserve a memory of a craftsman who survives a catastrophe sent by the gods. The surviving lines are brief but chilling. The sky burned, fire descended. The craftsman fled again to his boat. Fire before water, not rainstorms, not floods alone. Something descending, something burning. Cross the Mediterranean to Egypt, and you encounter the Book of the Heavenly Cow. Ra decides to destroy humanity, but the method matters. His eye becomes Sekhmet, a raging flame that nearly exterminates all life. The destruction is so intense that the gods have to stop it with a flood pouring water dyed red across the land. Scholars call this metaphor. But metaphors do not need floods to stop fire. Memories do. Cross the Atlantic to Mesoamerica. The Popol Vuh describes earlier worlds destroyed before the current one. In the destruction of the wooden people, the sky serpents descend breathing fire. Resin falls from the sky. The earth darkens. Then comes the great flood. Fire, darkness, water. In that order, move north to indigenous North American traditions. The Ojibwe remember a time when falling stars burned the earth and waters rose to cover it. The Paiute speak of the sun falling in pieces, igniting the land, followed by a flood that drowned the valleys. The Cree remember the night the sky broke open and fire rained down before the waters came. The language shifts, the imagery shifts, but the sequence does not. Cross the Pacific to China. The Shu Jing records a time when waters rose to the heavens during the reign of Emperor Yao. But before the flood, Chinese tradition speaks of the sky pillars breaking, of the celestial vault collapsing. Gun attempts to control the flooding, not because it is rain, but because something has destabilized the structure of the world. These are not gentle floods. They are world failures. Structural collapses. When anthropologists cataloged flood myths in the 19th and 20th centuries, they identified over 200 cultures preserving deluge narratives. What they emphasized was water. What they did not emphasize was order, fire, or explosion from the sky. Darkness, flood, disappearance of an elite class, rescue of knowledge, reset, again and again. These are not interchangeable elements. They form a chain. Break the chain, and the story stops making sense. Keep the chain intact, and something uncomfortable emerges. These myths are not independent inventions. They are degraded memories of a single type of event experienced globally. And that brings us back to the King List. Because the King List does not say the kings faded away. It does not say they were overthrown. It does not say they were replaced. It says the flood swept over. As if the disappearance was not political, but environmental, not gradual, but instantaneous, not selective, but total. And then kingship had to begin again, lowered from heaven again, restarted in fragments. So the question sharpens. If there was a real event powerful enough to generate this pattern across the world, would the earth still carry its scar? Would geology remember what myth remembers? Would there be a layer, a boundary, a signal that something catastrophic happened fast enough to erase a civilization before it could adapt? The answer, according to the evidence you outlined, is yes. and it lies in a layer that runs beneath our feet. Geologists call it the black mat, a thin, carbon-rich layer found across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. It appears suddenly in the stratigraphic record around 12,800 years ago. Below it, one world. Above it, another. Below it, thriving ecosystems, megafauna, human cultures like Clovis. Above it, extinction, population collapse, ecological shock. The black mat is not charcoal from ordinary wildfires. It contains nanodiamonds, melt glass, shocked quartz, magnetic microspherules, platinum group elements. Materials that do not form in normal Earth processes. Materials that require extreme temperature and pressure. The same materials found at the boundary that marks the asteroid impact which killed the dinosaurs. Except this boundary is recent, humanly recent, and it coincides almost perfectly with the date suggested by the flood narratives and implied by the King List's rupture. Around 12,800 years ago, fragments of a comet entered Earth's atmosphere and detonated in a series of massive airbursts across the northern hemisphere. Not a single impact, a chain of explosions. Enough energy to ignite continent-wide firestorms, vaporize surface materials into nanodiamonds, and fracture ice sheets miles thick. Imagine what that would look like from the ground. The sky igniting, the horizon turning white, then orange, then red. Heat arriving not gradually, but instantly. Forests combusting, grasslands exploding into flame, animals burning where they stand. Smoke rising into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight, plunging the planet into darkness. This is the darkness the myths remember. Then the ice collapses. The Laurentide ice sheet fractures. Meltwater pours into the oceans in volumes that collapse circulation systems. Sea levels surge. Tsunamis race across basins. Coastlines disappear. River valleys drown. The flood is not rain, it is displacement. This sequence matches the myths too well to ignore. Fire from the sky, darkness, flood, and in the aftermath, a long cold descent into the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that lasts over 1,000 years. Human populations crash, megafauna vanish, cultures disappear. And if there were kings, if there were rulers, if there were centralized systems operating before this event, they would not survive the first hours. Their cities would burn, their coastal centers would drown, their records would vanish, only fragments would remain. Only survivors, and survivors do not preserve worlds. They preserve memory. They carve what they can into clay. They encode it into myth. They warn the future in the only language that lasts when everything else is erased. This is why the King List matters. It is not proof by itself, but it behaves exactly like a document that inherited trauma. It records impossibility without explaining it. It marks a rupture without dramatizing it. It preserves the boundary because the boundary is the point. Before this, something existed. After this, something diminished, tried to rebuild. And that leads us to the next question, one that is even harder to face. If there was a world before the flood, where are its ruins? Why don't we find its cities? Why don't we excavate its monuments? The answer may be simpler and more devastating than we want it to be. Because when sea levels rose by hundreds of feet after the ice collapsed, the places humans lived were erased. Not symbolically, physically, submerged, buried, lost beneath oceans. Humans have always lived along coastlines, river valleys, fertile lowlands, and those are precisely the places that vanished. The continental shelves, the exposed plains, the drowned river systems, Doggerland beneath the North Sea, Sundaland beneath Southeast Asia, the Persian Gulf oasis where the Tigris and Euphrates once drained into a fertile basin, entire habitable worlds now underwater. If there were cities there, we will not find them without looking beneath the sea. So when archaeology fails to find the antediluvian world, that failure is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of location. We are searching on mountaintops and deserts for a civilization that lived where 80% of humanity still lives today, near water, near coasts, and those coasts no longer exist. This is why civilization seems to reappear suddenly after the flood, because it did not begin from nothing. It restarted from fragments. Survivors carried knowledge inland to refuge zones, to highlands, to places that remained above water. And from those fragments, they rebuilt, slowly, imperfectly, remembering more than inventing. And this is where the story turns from destruction to recovery. Because not everyone died. Knowledge did not vanish completely. It fractured, it scattered, it survived in people. And those people appear again and again at the beginning of post-flood civilizations, not as inventors, but as teachers, as sages, as those who already knew. Continuing from exactly where we left off, without compressing rhythm and without unnecessary line breaks. Those survivors do not appear in the record as ordinary people. They appear as anomalies, as figures who arrive already knowing things others do not. In Mesopotamia, they are remembered as the Apkallu, the 7 sages who existed before the flood and emerged afterward to advise kings and restore order. The texts describe them not as gods in the modern sense, but as culture bearers. They taught writing, they taught irrigation, they taught measurement architecture and ritual law. And most importantly, they are explicitly placed on both sides of the catastrophe. They belong to the world before the flood, yet act in the world after it. That alone should give us pause. The Babylonian priest Berosus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, but drawing from much older sources, describes the first of these sages, Owans, as a being who emerged from the sea and instructed humanity in the arts of civilization. He taught them how to build cities, how to establish laws, how to measure land, how to understand the heavens. When his work was done, he returned to the waters. Berosus does not describe a god creating knowledge. He describes a teacher transferring it, someone who already possessed it giving it to people who had lost it. The pattern repeats in Egypt. Long before dynastic pharaohs, Egyptian tradition speaks of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, semi-divine rulers who governed during a primordial age before recorded history. The Sumerian King List records reigns lasting thousands of years during this era, followed by a sudden transition to human kings. These Shemsu Hor are credited with establishing the foundations of Egyptian civilization, astronomy, temple, orientation, sacred geometry, irrigation, kingship itself. Later tradition would elevate them into gods, but the earliest texts describe them as predecessors, not creators, as those who came before whose knowledge was inherited rather than invented. In India, the story takes another familiar shape. The Matsya Purana describes Manu being warned of a coming flood and instructed to build a vessel. But Manu does not survive alone. He preserves the Saptarishi, the 7 sages. After the waters recede, these sages emerge to reestablish sacred knowledge, the Vedas, astronomy, ritual law, and the ordering of society. Indian astronomical texts preserve observations that would only make sense if they were first recorded thousands of years earlier than their written form. Star positions, precession cycles, calendar systems calibrated to epochs long past. These are not discoveries made fresh. They are inheritances preserved imperfectly through catastrophe. Cross to Mesoamerica, and you find the same structure expressed differently. The Popol Vuh describes the first people of the dawn not as primitives, but as beings whose vision was unlimited, who knew everything under the sky. Their knowledge frightened the gods who dimmed their understanding. Read literally, this sounds like myth. Read as memory, it sounds like a recognition that earlier people knew more, and that later humanity lived with diminished capacity. Knowledge was lost, not gained. In China, the sage kings Yao Xun and Yu appear after great floods to establish order. Yu is remembered not for inventing flood control, but for knowing how to manage it. He reorganizes rivers. He restores balance. The Chinese tradition does not portray him as experimenting blindly. He acts as someone applying inherited understanding to a broken world. Across South America, Viracocha emerges after a deluge to teach architecture, agriculture, and law. In Polynesian traditions, navigators cross vast oceans, using astronomical knowledge that predates written records. In Australian Aboriginal memory, sky heroes establish law after a world-ending transformation. Different names, different landscapes, same role. Survivors, teachers, restorers. This consistency matters, because independent invention does not produce identical narrative roles across the planet. Memory does. When survivors of a catastrophe disperse, they do not carry the same fragments. One group preserves astronomy, another preserves agriculture, another preserves ritual law, another preserves stories. Over generations, these fragments recombine unevenly. Civilization does not reappear smoothly. It reappears in bursts, unevenly distributed astonishingly fast. This explains something that has long troubled archaeology. Why agriculture appears independently in multiple regions within a few thousand years. Why monumental architecture emerges with little developmental lead-up. Why early cities seem overplanned. Why early writing systems encode complex information immediately. These are not sudden leaps forward. They are recoveries. Attempts to reconstruct something remembered, but no longer fully understood. And this brings us to the first place where reconstruction becomes visible in stone rather than myth. Gobekli Tepe. Built over 11,600 years ago, exactly as the Younger Dryas ends and climate stabilizes. Not a village, not a city, not a dwelling, a monument. Massive T-shaped pillars, carved with animal symbols and abstract forms. Astronomically aligned, deliberately designed, and then, after 16 centuries of use, deliberately buried. Gobekli Tepe does not fit the narrative of gradual development. The oldest layers are the most sophisticated. The carvings are most refined. The architecture is most ambitious. As time passes, the structures become smaller, simpler, less precise. This is the opposite of what invention looks like. This is what loss looks like. Someone knew how to build something extraordinary. Over generations, that knowledge degraded. The site contains no evidence of agriculture, no domestic hearths, no permanent habitation. The builders came constructed, gathered, performed rituals, and left. This was not a settlement. It was a memory site, a place to encode knowledge symbolically, ritually, astronomically. And when they buried it, they did not destroy it. They preserved it. As if they understood that knowledge could be lost again and wanted to protect what remained for whoever came next. Gobekli Tepe appears exactly when survivors, would have been able to emerge from refugia exactly when climate stabilized, exactly when rebuilding could begin. It is not the beginning of civilization, it is the reboot, the architectural equivalent of the Sumerian King List. A record not of origin, but of recovery. From here, the pattern accelerates. Within a few thousand years, permanent settlements expand. Agriculture stabilizes, cities appear, kingship returns, writing emerges. And when writing does emerge, it does not emerge tentatively. It appears as a tool already understood. At Uruk, the earliest tablets are not myths. They are administrative records, grain counts, labor assignments, temple inventories, bureaucracy, as if writing was needed to manage something that already existed. Kingship, too, does not appear as a new idea. It is described as something lowered from heaven, restored, reinstated. The same phrase used for the antediluvian kings is used again after the flood. The institution survives. The people do not. The framework remains. The substance is gone. This is why the reign lengths shrink. Whatever system allowed continuity across millennia broke. The survivors copied the framework without fully understanding how it once functioned. They preserved rituals. They preserved titles. They preserved symbols. But the deep coherence was lost. Unity fractures into competing city-states. Knowledge fragments across cultures. Memory degrades into myth. And yet the warning remains, embedded in clay, embedded in stone, embedded in stories told on every continent. There was a world before this one. It ended suddenly. It was not primitive. It was not insignificant. And it vanished in a single sequence of fire, darkness, and flood. Which brings us to the final question, the one that refuses to go away. If this happened once, can it happen again? The geological record says yes. The sky has struck the earth before. It will strike again. And when it does, the question will not be whether humanity survives. Some always do. The question will be what they remember and what they choose to preserve. What they choose to preserve will determine whether the next civilization begins with understanding or with myth. Because survival alone is not continuity. Continuity requires memory, and memory is fragile when the systems that protect it collapse. We tend to imagine knowledge as something permanent, something cumulative, something that naturally grows over time. But history shows the opposite. Knowledge is contextual. It depends on specialists, institutions, transmission chains, stable environments. Break those, and knowledge evaporates faster than cities. Libraries burn, servers corrode, expertise dies with the people who carry it. What remains are fragments, procedures, without theory, rituals, without explanation symbols, without keys. This is exactly what we see after the flood. Survivors rebuild, but they rebuild unevenly. They remember how to align structures to the sky, but not always why. They remember how to organize labor, but not always how to maintain unity. They remember kingship, but not the system that sustained it. They remember that authority once came from heaven, but heaven no longer speaks in the same way. So kings rule shorter lives. Cities compete instead of coordinating. Writing records quantities, but struggles to preserve meaning. The Sumerian King List does not hide this decline. It documents it. It records the transition from impossibly long reigns to merely long ones, then to human ones, then to ordinary mortality. It records the fragmentation of power from a unified pre-flood world into competing city-states. It does not celebrate this change. It observes it, almost clinically, as if the scribes knew they were living in a diminished version of something older. And this is the crucial point. The King List is not propaganda. If it were, it would exaggerate the present, not the past. It would glorify contemporary kings, not ancient ones. It would compress the pre-flood section or omit it entirely. Instead, it places the impossible at the beginning, preserves it faithfully, and marks its end with a single devastating sentence. Then the flood swept over. That line is not explanatory. It is final. Everything that follows exists because something ended. Once you see this pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee it elsewhere. Egyptian kings trace their legitimacy to a primordial age ruled by gods and semi-divine ancestors. Chinese dynasties justified their authority through continuity with sage kings who restored order after catastrophe. Hindu cosmology frames history as cycles of destruction and renewal, not linear progress. Mesoamerican calendars reset worlds repeatedly. Even later traditions, stripped of geological detail, preserve the core intuition. Civilization is not guaranteed. It can be interrupted. It has been interrupted before. This reframes the entire story of human origins. The question is no longer, how did civilization begin? But how many times has it begun again? And if we are living in a rebuilt world rather than an original one, then much of what we call myth may be something closer to damaged history. Not lies, not inventions, but memories compressed into symbolic language because the technical vocabulary was lost. This also explains why the past feels haunted, why ancient monuments seem to know more than their builders should, why early civilizations appear fully formed, why there is always a sense of inheritance without a clear ancestor. We are living among echoes, fragments of a system that once functioned at a scale we can barely reconstruct, and this brings us uncomfortably close to the present. Because the conditions that erased the previous world are not unique. The geological record shows repeated impacts, repeated climate shocks, repeated collapses. We are not living at the end of history. We are living between catastrophes. And like the people before the flood, we have concentrated our civilization in vulnerable places. Coastlines, river deltas, fertile lowlands. The same environments that were erased last time. Our systems are more complex than anything the antediluvian world could have imagined. But complexity is not resilience. It is dependency. Electricity, satellites, global logistics, digital memory. Break a few key nodes and knowledge becomes inaccessible overnight, not destroyed. Inaccessible, which is often worse, because future survivors might know something existed without knowing how to use it. If a catastrophe were to occur tomorrow, some people would survive. That is almost certain, but they would not inherit our world. They would inherit fragments, manuals without context, data without infrastructure, stories without verification. And over generations, those fragments would turn into myths. Warnings. Legends about a time when humans commanded invisible forces, spoke across the planet, bent energy to their will. Stories future scholars might dismiss as fantasy. This is why the King List matters now. Not because it proves a lost super civilization in the way popular culture imagines, but because it shows us how memory behaves after collapse. It shows us how survivors think. They preserve what feels impossible. They carve warnings into durable media. They repeat the same story across generations because forgetting once was almost fatal. The antediluvian kings are not important because of how long they ruled. They are important because of how suddenly they disappeared. They represent a world that believed itself stable until it wasn't, a system that functioned until it didn't, a civilization that did not see the night coming until the sky burned. We are not special in that regard. We are simply later. And that leaves us with a final reflection, one that the ancient scribes may have understood better than we do. Progress is not guaranteed. Memory is not permanent. Civilization is not linear. It is cyclical, fragile, and always one catastrophe away from becoming myth. The people who carved the King List did not know our world would exist, but they understood something timeless. If the story is not preserved, it will be repeated. And if it is preserved only as myth, it will not be believed until it happens again. The question they leave us with is not whether the world before the flood existed. The evidence suggests that something did. The real question is whether when our own boundary arrives, there will be anyone left who remembers enough to warn the next world. And if there is one final thing the ancient record asks us to confront, it is this. Memory is not preserved by truth alone. It is preserved by fear. The fear of forgetting. The fear of repeating what cannot be survived twice. That fear is written into clay, into stone, into ritual, into stories that refuse to fade, even when their meaning becomes opaque. The scribes who copied the Sumerian King List were not naive. They lived in a world of ordinary human lifespans. They governed cities with walls, markets, disputes, wars, droughts, and politics. They knew perfectly well that people did not live for tens of thousands of years, and yet they copied those reigns anyway, line by line, number by number, century after century. Not because they believed the numbers in the way we believe statistics, but because they believed the boundary. They believed something fundamental had ended. They believed their own world existed only because another one had failed. That is what we tend to miss when we ask whether the antediluvian kings were literal or symbolic. The question itself is too small. What mattered to the scribes was not how long those kings ruled, but that their reigns belonged to a different order of reality. A world with continuity they no longer possessed. A system of authority that did not fracture into decades and dynasties, but endured across spans of time that felt incomprehensible to later survivors. Whether those spans were counted in years, generations, or something we no longer have language for, is secondary. What mattered was that the system broke. And when it broke, everything changed. The flood line in the King List is not dramatic. It is not embellished. It is not mythic in tone. It does not explain, justify, or moralize. It simply marks a rupture. Then the flood swept over. That is the language of someone recording a fact too large to narrate. The kind of event that leaves no witnesses capable of telling the whole story. The kind of ending that can only be marked, not described. And after that line, the world becomes familiar. Kings become mortal. Cities compete. Power transfers. Authority must be justified again and again. The age of continuity is gone. The age of repair begins. This is why the same structure appears everywhere. In Egypt, the age of the gods gives way to dynastic kings. In India, the Satya Yuga collapses into later ages of decline. In Mesoamerica, previous worlds are destroyed before the current one stabilizes. In China, sage kings restore order after cosmic disruption. These are not independent fantasies. They are cultural ways of saying the same thing. Something ended. What followed was not a beginning, but a recovery. We prefer stories of ascent, of progress from ignorance to knowledge, from chaos to order. But the deeper record suggests something far less comforting. That order existed, collapsed, and was partially rebuilt. That knowledge was once more integrated than it is now. That humanity has not climbed steadily upward, but staggered forward, carrying fragments of something it no longer fully understands. And this is why early civilizations feel so uncanny, why their monuments seem overqualified for their supposed technological stage, why their cosmologies appear sophisticated before their tools do, why writing arrives not as experimentation, but as administration, why kingship arrives not as innovation, but as inheritance. These are the fingerprints of memory, not invention. When survivors rebuild, they do not ask what is possible. They ask what used to exist. They copy forms whose function they only partially grasp. They reenact rituals whose original purpose has faded. They align stones to skies because they remember that the sky once mattered more than they can explain. They carve lists of kings because authority once flowed differently, and they are trying to restore its legitimacy without understanding its original source. We are doing the same thing now, whether we admit it or not. We inherit systems we no longer fully comprehend. Technologies built on layers of abstraction so deep that no single person understands them end to end. Institutions justified by tradition rather than function. Narratives of progress that mask how vulnerable our continuity actually is. The antediluvian world was not destroyed because it was weak. It was destroyed because it was exposed, because it existed in harmony with a planet that does not promise stability, because it assumed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. And that assumption is always the most dangerous one. The ancient myths did not survive because they were entertaining. They survived because they were necessary. Because somewhere deep in human memory is the understanding that civilization can vanish faster than it can be built, that kings can disappear in a single night, that knowledge can fragment beyond recognition, that the world can end without warning, not with a slow decline, but with fire, darkness, and rising seas. The scribes preserved that memory not to glorify the past, but to warn the future. They left us a record that says, without saying it directly, this has happened before. Do not assume it cannot happen again. Whether the antediluvian kings ruled for literal millennia or represent a form of continuity we no longer understand is ultimately less important than the lesson their disappearance encodes. Systems can fail, worlds can reset. Survivors will remember, and future civilizations will debate whether those memories were myths or history. We are not the first to ask these questions. We are simply the latest. And like those who came before us, we will be judged not by how advanced our world becomes, but by what survives when it ends. And that brings us slowly and deliberately to the edge of the question. The ancient record never answers outright. Not because it could not, but because it was never meant to. Some questions are not solved, they are carried. The people who inherited the world after the flood did not know exactly what had been lost. They only knew that something immense had ended. Something structured, something unified, something that had allowed continuity beyond ordinary human limits. They felt the absence before they understood it, and so they built around that absence. They shaped their societies in response to a missing center. This is why authority after the flood become so obsessed with legitimacy. Kings do not simply rule, they must be chosen, lowered from heaven, anointed by rituals traced back to before the catastrophe. Every early civilization anchors its power not in innovation, but in ancestry, in continuity with a vanished order. Because without that continuity, power feels temporary, fragile, exposed. The same is true of knowledge. After the flood, knowledge is no longer seamless. It becomes compartmentalized. Astronomy survives here, agriculture there, architecture somewhere else. No single culture carries the whole inheritance. And so, civilizations trade, borrow, adapt, recombine. What we call cultural exchange may in part be the slow reassembly of something that once existed as a whole. This helps explain why no ancient civilization ever claims to have invented civilization itself. They all claim to have received it from gods, from sages, from ancestors, from a previous age. In Sumer, kingship descends from heaven. In Egypt, it passes from the followers of Horus. In India, it survives through Manu and the Rishis. In Mesoamerica, it is restored after the destruction of earlier worlds. The language varies. The implication does not. Civilization is remembered, not created. And this memory carries a quiet grief. You can hear it in the King List. You can feel it in the deliberate burial of Gobekli Tepe. You can sense it in the insistence on recording impossibility without explanation. These are not triumphalist records. They are elegies. Markers left by people who knew they were living in the aftermath of something they could never fully restore. We tend to project our own confidence backward, imagining that the past was always struggling toward us. But the deeper record suggests something inverted, that the past may have been struggling away from something it lost, that early civilizations were not naive beginnings, but careful reconstructions built on memory, fear, and fragments. And if that is true, then our own moment deserves to be looked at differently, not as the pinnacle of a long ascent, but as a temporary coherence in a much longer cycle. A coherence dependent on stable climate, intact infrastructure, uninterrupted transmission, and the assumption that tomorrow will arrive as expected. The antediluvian world likely made that same assumption. Its kings ruled long enough that continuity felt natural. Its systems endured long enough to feel permanent. Its people had no reason to believe the sky could burn or the seas could rise fast enough to erase everything they knew. Until it happened. The scribes who came after understood this in their bones. They did not predict the future. They warned it. They did not explain the catastrophe. They marked it. And they trusted that someone someday would recognize the pattern. We are those someone. We are living in a world that has rediscovered the sky as a source of existential risk. We track near-Earth objects. We model climate instability. We understand intellectually that civilization is vulnerable, but understanding is not the same as preparation, and memory is not the same as resilience. The King List survives because clay survives. Gobekli Tepe survives because it was buried. Myths survive because they are told. But much of our knowledge exists in forms that assume continuity, electricity, networks, maintenance, specialists. Remove a few conditions and centuries of understanding become unreadable overnight. If there is a lesson embedded in the antediluvian record, it is not about gods or giants or impossible rains. It is about fragility, about how quickly a world can pass from functioning reality into contested memory. about how future civilizations may look back at us and argue over whether our stories were literal or symbolic, exaggerated or misunderstood. And they may miss the point in the same way we often do. Because the point is not whether every detail is exact. The point is that something ended suddenly and completely enough to fracture continuity, and that those who survived tried desperately to make sure that ending would not be forgotten. The world before the flood is not asking us to believe in it. It is asking us to recognize it as a warning, as a mirror, as a reminder that civilization is not an inheritance guaranteed by time, but a structure rebuilt again and again by people who remember what happens when it collapses. If there is ever a third version of human civilization, it will begin the same way the second did. With fragments, with myths, with lists that seem impossible, with monuments that feel too advanced for their time, and with survivors who know but cannot fully explain that there was a world before. What they leave behind will determine how much of us is remembered and how much becomes legend. And that is where the circle closes, not with an answer, but with a responsibility. Because the ancient record does not ask us to reconstruct the antediluvian world in detail. It does not give us blueprints, technologies, or instructions. What it gives us is a pattern, a rhythm, a warning written slowly, patiently, across cultures, materials, and millennia. It tells us that continuity is an achievement, not a default, that memory must be actively protected or it will collapse into story, and that when story replaces understanding, repetition becomes inevitable. The people who lived after the flood did not think of themselves as pioneers. They thought of themselves as inheritors who had arrived too late. Their rituals look backward, their kings look upward, their myths look behind them towards something that had already vanished. Even their calendars are haunted by cycles of destruction and renewal, as if time itself could not be trusted to move in a straight line. This is why the idea of linear progress feels so modern. It is a belief that only emerges when a civilization has gone long enough without interruption to forget how easily interruption occurs. The antediluvian memory interrupts that belief. It insists that history can reset, that knowledge can regress, that complexity can collapse faster than it is built. And the most unsettling part is that this is not speculative. We know it happens. We have seen it on smaller scales. The fall of Rome, the Bronze Age collapse, the loss of ancient technologies that had to be rediscovered centuries later, concrete that outlasted the knowledge of how to make it, maps that preserved coastlines no longer visible, mechanisms whose purpose was forgotten long before their materials decayed. These are small echoes of something much larger. Scale that up to a planetary event, and the logic becomes unavoidable. If a global catastrophe occurred today, most of what defines our civilization would not survive intact. It would not be carried forward in its full form. It would be reduced to traces, to ruins without manuals, to satellites without receivers, to data without power, to warnings that future people might not believe. And so the question shifts again, as it always does in this story. It is no longer about what happened before the flood. It is about what happens after one, about what is worth preserving when preservation itself is uncertain, about what kind of memory endures when explanation fails. The ancient survivors chose clay. They chose stone. They chose repetition. They chose myth, not because myth is false, but because myth survives when precision does not. They encoded sequence rather than mechanism. Fire, darkness, flood, loss, renewal. They trusted that even if the details were misunderstood, the warning would remain. We have different tools, vastly more powerful ones. But we also have greater fragility. Our knowledge is deeper, but thinner, more specialized, more dependent on uninterrupted systems, which means the burden of preservation is heavier, not lighter. If there is a lesson in the King List, in the flood myths, in Gobekli Tepe buried carefully beneath the soil, it is this. Do not assume continuity, design for rupture. Preserve not just data, but meaning. Not just records, but context. Not just achievements, but the knowledge of how they were achieved. Because one day, whether through fire from the sky, climate collapse, or some other failure, we have not yet named the systems we rely on may falter. And when they do, the next world will begin where ours ends. Not in total darkness, not in total ignorance, but in fragments. They will find our ruins. They will read our stories. They will debate whether our accounts were literal or symbolic. They will argue about whether our warnings were exaggerated or misunderstood. And if we have done our job well, they will recognize the pattern before it completes itself again. The world before the flood is not a mystery to be solved. It is a mirror held up to us across 12,000 years. It shows us what happens when continuity breaks. It shows us what survivors carry forward. And it asks us quietly, but relentlessly, what kind of memory we are leaving behind. Because history does not begin once. It begins again and again and again. And perhaps that is why the ancient record never ends with certainty. It ends with continuity unfinished, with questions deliberately left open, not because the answers were unknown, but because they were meant to be asked again. The scribes who preserved the King List did not know who would read it. They did not know how far into the future their clay tablets would travel. They did not know whether the next catastrophe would come in centuries or millennia. What they did know was that forgetting was more dangerous than misunderstanding. A misunderstood warning can still provoke caution. A forgotten one cannot. This is why the list was copied for 1,500 years. Not improved, not corrected, not rationalized. Copied. Faithfully. Even when its numbers made no sense in the present. Even when its implications were uncomfortable. Even when it suggested that the world had once operated according to rules that no longer applied. Especially then, because to alter the record would have been to pretend the rupture never happened. And pretending continuity where none exists is the fastest way to lose it again. In this sense, the antediluvian kings are not relics of an impossible past. They are markers of a boundary condition. They tell us what existed before a threshold was crossed, before the sky burned, before darkness fell, before the waters rose, before authority knowledge and continuity fractured into something smaller, more fragile, more human. We often ask why ancient people believed the gods withdrew after the flood. But perhaps that is the wrong framing. Perhaps what withdrew was not divinity, but coherence. A system of understanding that once unified sky, earth, time, and authority into a single framework. When that framework collapsed, what remained felt empty, distant, silent, and the silence was interpreted as absence. So gods retreat, kings shorten their reigns. Knowledge becomes sacred rather than functional. Ritual replaces mechanism. Myth replaces instruction. And slowly, over thousands of years, humanity rebuilds something workable but never quite whole. We live inside that inheritance. We call it civilization. We measure its success by growth, innovation, expansion. But the deeper measure may be continuity. How much of what we know survives beyond us? How clearly it can be understood without us? How well it warns those who come after? The people who survived the flood understood this instinctively. They did not try to preserve everything. They preserved patterns, sequences, boundaries. They preserved the knowledge that the world had ended once, and that it ended not because of moral failure or divine whim, but because the planet itself can change faster than culture can adapt. That knowledge alone is enough to reshape how we see ourselves. Because if civilization is a cycle, not a line, then the question is not how far we have come, but how prepared we are to start again. Not how advanced our technologies are, but how resilient our memory is. Not whether we believe the stories of the past, but whether future people will believe ours. The antediluvian world does not ask us to worship it. It asks us to remember it, to recognize that human history is deeper, more fragile, and more repetitive than our modern narratives allow. To accept that we are not standing at the beginning of everything, but somewhere in the middle of a long sequence of endings and restarts. And if there is one final lesson buried in clay and stone, repeated in myths across the planet, it is this: civilization is not a possession. It is a practice, one that must be maintained, transmitted, and defended against forgetting. When that practice fails, the world does not end, it resets. Those who come after will look back at us the way we look back at the antediluvian kings, with doubt, with curiosity, with skepticism, with fragments of truth filtered through story. And they will ask the same question we ask now: was it real or was it myth? And the answer, as always, will depend on what survives. And that dependence on what survives is the quiet, unsettling core of the entire record. Because survival does not guarantee comprehension. The future does not inherit the past intact. It inherits what endures long enough to be noticed and what can be interpreted without the context that once gave it meaning. This is why so much of the ancient world feels simultaneously familiar and alien. We recognize the forms, the symbols, the concerns, but the logic behind them often feels just out of reach, as if we are reading a language where half the grammar has vanished. The antediluvian memory sits precisely in that space, too consistent to dismiss, too incomplete to reconstruct. It resists both belief and disbelief, and that resistance may be intentional, because a warning that is too explicit can be ignored. A warning that must be wrestled with tends to linger. The scribes did not tell future generations what to think. They showed them a pattern and trusted that pattern to do the work. A world existed. It ended suddenly. Survivors remembered. Civilization resumed altered. Authority returned diminished. Knowledge survived fragmented. And the cycle continued. Every civilization since has lived inside that structure, whether it recognized it or not. Even our modern institutions echo it. We speak of founding fathers, golden ages, lost wisdom, dark ages, enlightenments. These are not scientific categories. They are memory structures, ways of organizing time around rupture and recovery. What makes the antediluvian record different is scale. It does not describe the fall of a city or an empire. It describes the failure of a world. And that scale is why it is so difficult to integrate into our modern frameworks. We are comfortable with collapse as long as it is local. We struggle with collapse that is planetary. Yet, geology tells us the planet does not negotiate. It does not scale its disruptions to our political boundaries or cultural expectations. When it shifts everywhere. And when it does not ask whether we are ready. The people before the flood were not less intelligent than us. They were not naive. They were not myth makers, inventing stories to explain thunderstorms. They were people who lived long enough inside stability to believe it was permanent, just like us. And when that belief failed, it failed catastrophically. That is why their survivors did not leave us comfort. They left us caution. They did not say the world was destroyed because people were evil. That interpretation comes later. They said the world was destroyed because something came from above, because the sky burned, because the waters rose. They described mechanics, not morality. Sequence, not judgment. And that distinction matters. Because it removes the illusion of control. It suggests that civilization is not erased as punishment, but as consequence, as exposure, as alignment with forces that operate far beyond human intention. This is uncomfortable knowledge. It destabilizes the idea that progress alone protects us. It implies that no amount of advancement can exempt a civilization from the physical realities of the planet it inhabits. And that implication is exactly what the ancient record refuses to let us forget. So, the question is no longer whether the antediluvian world existed in the way we imagine it. The question is whether we are willing to see ourselves as potentially antediluvian to someone else, whether we are prepared to accept that our own era may one day be reduced to fragments debated by people who will never fully understand us. They will find traces, plastics embedded in sediment, ruins of coastal cities beneath the sea, strange isotopic signatures, myths about a time when humans spoke across the planet and bent energy to their will. And they will argue, just as we do. Was it real? Was it exaggerated? Was it symbolic? And if the ancient record teaches us anything, it is that this argument misses the point. What matters is not whether every detail survives accurately. What matters is that the pattern survives at all. That someone remembers there was a boundary. That someone marks the line where the world changed. That someone understands that continuity is not guaranteed. The antediluvian kings were remembered because their disappearance mattered more than their reigns. Their loss became the reference point against which everything else was measured. Before the flood, after the flood. That simple division carries more weight than any chronology. We may one day be divided the same way. Before the collapse, after the collapse, and future scribes, whatever medium they use, will struggle with the same dilemma. How to preserve memory without explanation, how to warn without inducing disbelief, how to mark an ending without fully understanding it. The people who came before us chose endurance over clarity, clay over precision, myth over mechanism. And because of that choice, we are still listening. Whether we choose as wisely may determine whether anyone listens to us. Because the act of remembering is not passive. It's a decision. A commitment to hold on to something fragile, something fleeting, something that might otherwise be lost to time. The survivors of the Great Cataclysm understood this. They knew that to forget was to risk erasing everything, not just the knowledge of how to build, but the very essence of what made civilization possible. The records they left behind weren't just stories. They were Lifeline's attempts to preserve the most essential pieces of a shattered world. But the fragility of memory is also its strength. It's the reason the survivors were not content to simply live. They wanted to understand, to connect their broken world with a future that could only be imagined. They carved their stories into stone and clay because they understood something fundamental. What is forgotten can be reborn, but only if it is remembered. If knowledge can survive the passage of time, survive wars, disasters, and collapse, then the foundation of civilization remains. Yet the very nature of that survival is paradoxical. What we think of as the past is not a perfect continuum, but a patchwork of moments, ideas, and remnants. Pieces that have been altered by time, by environment, by the very nature of human perception. Our ancestors could only capture fragments, and even those were subject to the vagaries of interpretation, of misreading the past, of overlaying their own understanding upon the fragments they unearthed. And here we are today, part of that same continuum, interpreting the fragments of our own time. Just as the Sumerians looked at their clay tablets and saw a memory of a distant ancient world, we too look at our records, our data, our creations, and ask, what will future generations find? Will they be able to reconstruct the full picture? Will they see the complexity of what we built? Or will they only see pieces, fragments, and wonder at the patterns they can't fully understand? This is the paradox of our civilization. We are building something that will one day be the subject of archaeological wonder and study. We are laying down traces, some intentional, some accidental, that will define our time for millennia. And the greatest question is whether those who come after us will be able to piece together the story. Will they see our world for what it truly was, or will they misinterpret it as we have misinterpreted the past? And just as the survivors of the Great Flood left behind not just the ruins of their cities, but the very memory of what was lost, so too will we leave behind traces of our own world. Traces that will in some form be rediscovered, analyzed, and perhaps misunderstood. In this way, we are not so different from those who came before us. We too live with the awareness that our world is finite, that our time is limited, and that what we take for granted today may one day be a mystery. The ancient world, with its kings and their impossibly long reigns, offers a lesson in this fragility of civilization. The survivors who preserved their history knew that the world was cyclical, that great civilizations could rise and they could fall, and all that would remain would be the stories, the memories, and the fragments. So, as we live in a time when we are building the foundations for future generations, we must ask ourselves, what are we preserving? What knowledge, what memory will survive us? And when the time comes, when the world shifts, when the floodwaters rise again, will the fragments we leave behind tell the story of who we were? Will they offer a clue to the future of humanity? Or will they, like those who came before, be scattered across time, waiting to be rediscovered by those who can only piece together the broken remnants of our once great civilization? As the ancient texts remind us, we are not the first to walk this path, but we may be the last to remember it. And the question we must face is simple. How will we choose to be remembered? Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. To live not just in the present, but with an eye on the future. To understand that every choice we make today, every structure we build, every piece of knowledge we pass on, may one day be the key to unlocking the story of who we were. And in that sense, we are both the survivors and the witnesses, preserving the memory of our time in the hope that it will not be forgotten. In the end, it is not the floods or the firestorms, the cataclysms or the chaos that define us. It is the memory of what came before the fragments we leave behind and the choices we make today to preserve, to remember, and to understand. Because in the end, what survives us is the story we tell. And that story, once preserved, becomes a bridge between the past and the future. It's not just a tale of survival, but a testament to the resilience of humanity. The survivors of the Great Catastrophe didn't just rebuild, they consciously sought to preserve and transmit the knowledge of their predecessors. They didn't abandon the old world, they made it live again. Through their efforts, the past was not lost, but woven into the fabric of the present, ensuring that even after the most devastating of events, the essence of what once was could rise again. But what happens when that memory is fragmented? When the stories are distorted, not because they are forgotten, but because they are reshaped by time, by necessity, by the evolving needs of the survivors. As history unfolds, it is not only the events that change, the way we perceive them changes too. The meanings we attach to the past shift with each new generation. Stories that once made perfect sense are reframed, interpreted, and reinterpreted until they become myths, legends, and sometimes mysteries. The Sumerians understood this. They didn't just record their kings' reigns, they preserved the idea that knowledge, civilization, and kingship were not original inventions, but ancient continuities that had endured through time, across catastrophes, across floods. What they left behind with all its flaws was an attempt to bridge the gap between what was and what could be. A legacy encoded not just in text, but in the very way they lived in their rituals, their monuments, and their stories. And so, as we stand on the threshold of our own history, we must ask, what will we leave behind? The world today is more interconnected, more complex than ever before. We have access to an overwhelming amount of information, yet we may also be the most distracted, the most fragmented generation. In the rush of daily life, in the chaos of modernity, how much are we truly preserving for those who will come after us? Will our digital archives, our social media feeds, our vast troves of data stand the test of time? Or will they fade into the ether, leaving behind only scattered traces of what we once were? Will future civilizations, if they emerge from the ashes of a collapsed world, be able to piece together our history from the fleeting digital footprints we leave behind? Or will they, like the Sumerians before us, be left to reconstruct a forgotten past from fragments, trying to make sense of a world long gone? The truth is, we don't know. But what we can control is how we live in the present. Just as the Sumerians encoded their knowledge into the clay, just as they understood the power of memory and the weight of history, we too have the ability to choose what we pass on. What we do today can become the foundation for future generations, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. So, in the face of uncertainty and the shadow of potential collapse, we must choose to be intentional in what we preserve. We must ask ourselves, just as the ancients did, how do we ensure that the story of who we were doesn't fade into oblivion? How do we protect the knowledge, the wisdom, and the lessons that we have accumulated over thousands of years? Perhaps the answer lies not in trying to predict the future, but in the choices we make today. In the small acts of preservation, writing, recording, creating, teaching, that accumulate over time, in the conversations we have, the books we read, the stories we tell, in the way we live, the choices we make, and the legacies we create for those who will one day look back and wonder how we lived, how we thought, and what we believed. In the end, the legacy of the past is not just what is left behind, but what is carried forward. The Sumerians, like so many cultures before and after them, left us a lesson that memory, knowledge, and civilization are never truly lost as long as someone is there to remember. They remind us that history is not linear. It is cyclical, built from the fragments of what came before, ever changing, ever evolving, and most importantly, ever remembered. And so, as we face our own challenges, our own moments of uncertainty, let us remember that we too are part of a much larger story, a story that stretches back through time and reaches forward into the future. What we do now, how we live, and what we choose to preserve will echo in the generations to come. The question then is not whether humanity will continue. The question is, what will we leave behind for those who come after us? What fragments of our civilization will survive the test of time, and will they be enough to tell the story of who we were and who we still have the potential to become? In the end, we are all survivors of a world that came before. The question is, how will we choose to be remembered as we navigate through our modern world full of both immense potential and profound uncertainty? We must embrace our role as both inheritors and custodians of knowledge. The ancients, whether through their sacred texts, their monuments, or their rituals, understood the importance of preserving memory. And as they did, we too must ensure that our knowledge, our lessons, our cultural touchstones are not swallowed up by time, by catastrophe, or by the very distractions of the world we live in today. Look at the way we build today, the massive cities that rise out of the earth, the incredible technologies that connect us, and the information that flows seamlessly between us across the globe. These are the creations of our civilization, vast, impressive, and yet fragile. They are built on the shoulders of the knowledge of the past, and every breakthrough we achieve is made possible by what came before. The knowledge of kings and sages, of architects and engineers, of storytellers and scribes has all shaped the world we know. We are merely the latest chapter in a long and evolving story. But as we stand in the present, we also know that the world we have built is vulnerable. We see it in the environmental crises we face, in the social and political divisions that seem to widen daily, and in the fragile nature of the systems we've come to depend on. Our greatest strength, our interconnectedness, is also our greatest weakness. The very technology that allows us to share knowledge instantly also makes us vulnerable to disruption on an unprecedented scale. The question now is, how do we ensure that the knowledge we cherish, our history, our achievements, our lessons, endures? Perhaps the answer is not just in how we preserve information, but in how we pass it forward. The Sumerians, through their King List and other records, understood that civilization was more than just what was built in their time. They knew that what came before and what would come after were intimately connected. They made their records not for themselves, but for those who would come after them, the survivors, who might one day need those fragments to rebuild. We must ask ourselves the same question. What are we building for the future? What are we leaving behind for the generations yet to come? Is it enough to simply survive? Or is our true task to make sure that we leave something enduring, something that can help those who follow us navigate their own challenges? Maybe like the survivors of the Great Flood, we too are living in a time of reconstruction. Perhaps the systems we have today, the political, social, and economic systems, are fragile, and we, like the survivors of the past, are rebuilding not from scratch, but from fragments. And just as they passed on their knowledge through the artifacts, rituals, and stories that survived, we too have the power to preserve the fragments of our civilization. It doesn't have to be monumental. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture. In fact, sometimes it's the small, deliberate actions, writing down our thoughts, recording our stories, teaching our children, preserving our environment that will have the most lasting impact. It's in the way we live our lives, in the way we treat others, in the way we nurture the world around us. The flood myths, the king lists, the ancient records that survived, they are not just stories from a distant past. They are warnings. They are reminders of what can be lost, but also of what can be saved. They speak to the resilience of humanity and to the incredible capacity we have to remember, rebuild, and pass on what we've learned. In the end, the legacy of the past is not just about what we preserve, but about how we live now. We are all connected, not just to our ancestors, but to those who will come after us. We have the power to shape the future, just as those who came before us shaped our present. And it is through this connection, this continuity, that we can truly ensure that what has been learned is never lost. So, as we look to the future, let us remember the lessons of the past, the importance of memory, the power of knowledge, and the resilience of humanity. And let us make sure that the world we leave behind is not just a world of ruins, but a world of hope, a world of continuity, and a world where the story of who we were is passed down not as a myth, but as a testament to all that we have survived and all that we have yet to become. The flood swept over, but the story didn't end there. It never truly ends. It only continues, carried forward by those who remember, those who preserve, and those who choose to rebuild. As we continue on this journey of rediscovery, we realize that the remnants of the past are not scattered just in the ruins of cities or the remnants of ancient texts, but in the way we shape our world today. The lessons we learn from the ancients, whether from their successes or their mistakes, are written not only in stone, but in the very fabric of our civilization. Look at the way we approach technology, for example. The rapid advancements in artificial intelligence, the global communication networks, and the innovations in sustainable energy. These are the modern reflections of the ancient drive for knowledge organization and the betterment of society. But just as those who came before us faced moments of catastrophic upheaval, we too face a future where the balance between progress and sustainability is delicate. What are we building now? What systems, knowledge, and infrastructures are we creating today that will either uplift or crumble under the weight of future challenges? We may be standing on the shoulders of giants, but the next generation will stand on our shoulders. Will they have a stable foundation to build upon, or will they be left to rebuild once again from the fragments of a broken world? One of the striking lessons from the ancients is the importance of continuity. In the Sumerian King List, the unbroken thread of leadership of knowledge passed down across generations is what enabled humanity to endure and recover. They may have faced loss and destruction, but their efforts to preserve what they could, their systems of writing, their knowledge of astronomy, their governance, allowed their descendants to rebuild and carry on. We must ask ourselves, how can we ensure continuity in our time? How can we preserve the knowledge, the structures, and the wisdom that have taken us so long to create? How can we build systems that are not only resilient in the face of environmental and technological challenges, but also flexible enough to adapt to the unknowns that lie ahead? As we answer these questions, we must also look at how we treat the Earth, the environment that has sustained us, and which is now showing signs of strain. The ancients, in their flood myths and stories of cosmic cataclysms, warned us that the Earth is not an unchanging entity, and that our actions can have dire consequences. We may not face the cosmic disasters that they described, but we do face the reality of climate change, the depletion of natural resources, and the degradation of ecosystems. It is here in the balance between our technological advancements and our responsibility to the planet that we must find our path forward. Just as the survivors of ancient cataclysms had to rebuild with what they had, we too must find ways to rebuild our relationship with the Earth. To not just survive, but to thrive in harmony with the world around us. Perhaps in the end, the greatest lesson from the ancients is this: survival is not enough. It is not enough to simply get through a crisis or to rebuild after disaster. The real challenge, the real calling, is to ensure that what we build after the storm is something that can endure, something that will continue to grow, evolve, and pass down knowledge to the next generation. So, as we look to the future, let us remember that we are part of a long continuum of human history. We are both the heirs of what came before and the creators of what will come after. And just as the ancients preserved their memories in clay and stone, so too must we preserve our knowledge for those who will follow us. For the story of humanity is never truly over. It is a story that is always unfolding, always continuing. We may not know exactly what the future holds, but we do know this: it is up to us to make sure that when the floodwaters rise again, whether literal or metaphorical, we leave behind a foundation strong enough to survive. The story must go on, and we must make sure that when the time comes, we will be remembered not just for what we built, but for how we cared for the world and the knowledge we left for those who will one day follow in our footsteps. The flood swept over, yes. But the story, like humanity itself, is far from finished. And so, as we reflect on the ancient lessons, we recognize that the cycle of destruction and renewal is not just a tale of the past. It is a warning, a guide, and perhaps a prophecy for our times. It tells us that the world we have built, though impressive, is fragile. The floods, both literal and metaphorical, have come before, and they may very well come again. The question is not whether we can withstand them, but whether we can learn to navigate and prepare for the inevitable cycles of collapse and rebirth that all civilizations face. As we continue to unravel the ancient mysteries, we are reminded that there is always more to discover beneath the surface. There are still countless ruins submerged beneath the oceans, buried under the sands of deserts, and hidden in the deepest forests of the world. We may think we have found the limits of our history, but in reality, we are only scratching the surface. The ancient peoples, whether in Sumer Egypt or the Americas, knew that their time was not infinite. They built monumental structures, carved their stories into stone, and preserved their knowledge in ways that would last through time. But they were also aware of the impermanence of their world. And this awareness is precisely why they took the time to memorialize their achievements and disasters. They didn't just leave behind monuments, they left behind a warning. The world can change in an instant, and what is today may not be tomorrow. In our modern world, where we have vast technological networks, global communications, and incredible advancements in medicine and science, it is easy to believe that we are immune to such cataclysms. But the more we look back into history, the more we realize that every civilization has believed the same thing. The Sumerians thought their empire would last forever, just as the Egyptians and the Maya did. And yet all of them faced their own great floods, cataclysmic events that shattered their worlds and forced them to start anew. As we stand at the cusp of an uncertain future, we must ask ourselves, are we prepared to face our own flood, our own collapse? What are we doing today to ensure that the knowledge we have gained, both our triumphs and our failures, does not slip into obscurity? How can we, like the ancient scribes, ensure that our legacy will survive the inevitable catastrophes that await us? The answer lies in how we approach our current challenges. It lies in how we preserve our knowledge, how we pass it on to future generations, and how we learn from the mistakes of the past. We cannot afford to be complacent, thinking that our civilization is too advanced to fall. History teaches us that every empire, every great civilization has its end, but the end is not always final. If we can preserve the right pieces of knowledge, if we can ensure that the wisdom of our time is passed down, just as the Sumerians did with their king list, then perhaps we can build something that will endure even after the floodwaters have risen again. For the survivors of the ancient world, their task was clear: preserve what they could remember, what had been lost, and rebuild what was broken. And as we look to the future, it is our task now. We must preserve what we have learned, safeguard the knowledge that can guide the next generation, and prepare for the inevitable cycles of history that will shape the world to come. In the end, the story of humanity is not just about the rise and fall of king cities or civilizations. It is about the endurance of knowledge, the resilience of the human spirit, and the drive to rebuild even after everything has been swept away. As we face our own challenges and the uncertainties of tomorrow, let us remember that we are part of a long history, one that has seen cataclysms, collapses, and rebirths. And in that history, we are not the first to stand at the edge of the unknown. We are just another chapter in the ongoing story of humanity. The flood may come again, but so too will the survivors. And they will carry with them the knowledge of what once was rebuilding the world once more. What remains to be seen is how we prepare for that day, and what fragments of our civilization we will leave behind for those who come after us. The flood swept over, but the story is not over. It never truly ends. The flood may come again, but so too will the survivors. And they will carry with them the knowledge of what once was rebuilding the world once more. This cycle, this story of loss and rebirth is not something unique to the ancient past. It's something that could happen again, though we may not be able to recognize the signs until it is too late. The question that remains is, how will we prepare for that day? And what fragments of our civilization will we leave behind for those who come after us? Just like the survivors of the ancient flood, we too are part of a long chain of humanity, one that has survived countless upheavals. We may not face the same cataclysm as the flood, but we will face challenges: economic collapse, environmental changes, political upheavals. History teaches us that the world is never as stable as it may seem. The flood swept over, but the story is not over. It never truly ends. History is a loop, a continuous cycle of loss, survival, and renewal. Just as the ancient scribes painstakingly copied their king list to preserve the memory of what came before, we too are tasked with remembering not only the victories and advancements, but also the mistakes, the disasters that reshaped the world. For in those memories lie the lessons that could guide future generations. We can choose to ignore the signs to live as though the world will remain as it is unchanging. Or we can choose to learn to preserve what we have, to protect our knowledge, our history, and our civilization. The flood might come again, but so too will the survivors, and they will rebuild. The only question is, will we be ready?